Hello and welcome to Amagi, co-hosted by myself, Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube, and Nima Mahjour of economicsjunkie.com. We are here to tackle ideas, both ancient and modern, in an effort to bring you the tools needed to expand the power of your worldview, making you a more potent entity, professionally, politically, philosophically, or otherwise. We are graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. And this is episode 9, a response to Freedomain Radio about Trump's economy. How you doing, Nima?
It's a pleasure to be on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be on again with you as well this week. So, Stefan Molyneux over at Freedomain Radio had Robert Murphy on to talk some economics. What was it, about a week ago?
Yeah.
And for those who don't know, I actually had a run-in with Bob Murphy myself. I was brought on, or invited to the Tom Woods show to do a debate with him about modern money theory, which is what we will be talking about today, MMT. So if you want to go listen to that, you can go check it out. I think it was episode 1116, if I remember correctly. So this will be an interesting comeback for me to revisit this topic, particularly with the points that Bob likes to talk about. And what we wanted to do was look a little closer into the things that Bob and Steph talk about regarding the economy, because, well, instead of me describing why, I think we could just dive right into it. So, Nima, we've got some notes that we took, and if there's any particular place that you'd like to start that we could,
I guess we could just go chronologically.
Sure.
Whichever the earliest notes are, I can start with. I annotated my notes with the time.
I'm looking at your notes too.
Okay.
You made them better than I did.
Okay, all right. So we are starting then with 4 minutes and 20 seconds, right?
Dude.
So yes, Steph explains that there must be something larger in common to recessions like money supply and interest rates. And I just wanted to point out that we partially agree with that. There's something bigger at work. There's a big system behind these moves. We say it's lack of demand that is caused by lack of net private saving, that is caused by overtaxation, that causes most recessions and or depressions. Our position is that there's no big relevance of money supply or interest rates to causing recessions.
So, and then, because what I think what Steph opened with was, we keep seeing these recessions and / depressions happening within the U.S. economy. What are some of the things that we can look out for to start seeing these things, which, incidentally is what we talked about last week on our last show. But, and of course, Steph is into Austrian economics, and Bob Murphy is explicitly an Austrian economist, and they're looking at what causes these recessions from the viewpoint. And what exactly did Murphy claim that it was to be? That the interest rates are artificially suppressed by the Federal Reserve, right?
Right. That starts 6 minutes into it. Murphy says that the interest rate is artificially suppressed by the Fed, and the banking system floods the market with credit. And there's actually no such correlation between interest rates and credit creation. Also, the Fed always artificially pushes rates up, not down.
Can you get into that?
Sure.
Unpack that a little bit. So let's. I'm gonna rehash the Austrian argument. So we're all on the same page, which is that because the Federal Reserve controls the interest rates of the country, when the Federal Reserve lowers the interest rates, because the money becomes cheaper, it expands the money supply through the fractional reserve lending system because people are able to essentially afford it easier. And this essentially creates a boom because there's more money that's available, and when all that money goes out, the Federal Reserve, in order to continue paying its bills, cranks the interest rates back up, which not freezes, but slows down the supply of money, which is what causes the bust. So, according to modern money theory, and according to what we're saying here, that's not the case. You mentioned that it's something else.
Yeah, the interest rate itself doesn't really have any such impact on the economy, as we discussed, in previous shows. Raising interest rate actually increases the net money injection into the private sector, whereas cutting them has the opposite effect. And there's really no historical evidence that there's any correlation between inflation and these interest rates, or even negative correlation or whatever. No such thing.
So what is controlling the money supply then? If it's not the interest rate set by the Fed?
Well, it's the credit creation by the private banks, for the most part, that basically causes the money supply to increase. Every time a loan is made, the bank marks up the borrower's deposit and books a loan on their bank for their bank as an asset.
But isn't that consistent with what Stefan and Murphy are saying here, where if the bank is able to do that, isn't it easier for the bank to do that if the interest rates are lower?
Well, if the interest rates are lower, then all that means is, so if the Fed interest rate is lower, all that means that the cost of funds for the bank is lower, so they can charge lower rates to borrowers, because they're in a competitive lending market, different banks, and so they just charge whatever they think the proper risk premium is on top of the risk-free rate, which is set by the Fed. And so the borrowers, to them, yeah, they are getting cheaper loans, but also people with savings accounts are making less income. So the two balance each other out, essentially.
Well, and then the borrowers are definitely getting cheaper loans, but does that make them borrow more? I guess is the question.
Not necessarily. Because borrowing,
because the argument is if the interest rate lowers, the money gets cheaper, therefore people borrow more money.
Yeah. We have seen several periods with very low interest rates and banks not wanting to lend, and there have been periods with high interest rates with banks lending a lot. So there's really no such correlation. What's more relevant, I guess, is what's the income? Do we have economic growth? Do we have investment spending, etc. That determines whether banks will want to make loans or not. Corporate profit outlooks, stuff like that. And ultimately, whatever the Fed does, they don't control the premium that the banks charge on top of that. So the Fed rate is a basic component in the bank's pricing mechanism, of course. But, wherever that is at, the market adjusts to it. Currently, it's at a level where the government is essentially subsidizing people with money, because they've declared an interest rate of 2.6 or whatever, 2.4%. And if they didn't pay any such interest, or if they had a very low interest rate of 0.25%, then that would be the interest rate that you get on your savings accounts, and that would be the base risk-free rate that banks would apply when calculating prices for their loans. And then whatever they think the risk is for the loan, they would just charge on top of that.
So when you say the risk-free rate, because I think this doesn't jive well with the Austrian understanding of how the Fed works or how the government works. So we're saying risk-free rate. Now, why is it risk-free?
Because it's guaranteed by the issuer of that money, so they can't not pay out in that money. The government.
But the reason that the government offers these interest rates in the first place is to be able to attract the money that they're able to pay out with, right?
The reason why they do these used to be because under gold standard they need to maintain their gold stock. In today's world, there is no reason to do this. It's all just arbitrary.
So unpack that a little bit, because I think someone who's hearing this for the first time might not quite wrap their mind around that idea.
Well, whatever the Federal Reserve decides the new interest rate is, that's the rate that banks will be charging for interbank reserve loans. So whenever banks need to borrow reserves, then that's the interest rate they'll be paying on borrowing those reserves. And they need reserves in order to meet clearing demands. When checks clear from one bank to another, they need reserves when tax payments are made, and they need reserves when cash withdrawals are made. So whenever they're short on reserves, then they borrow, or they try to attract savings deposits. So they usually try to attract the savings deposits at a slightly lower rate than they would be paying on the interbank lending market. So that rate in and of itself really has no impact on the bank's lending activity. The bank's lending activity is determined by willing and able borrowers, or by the availability of willing borrowers.
This is exactly what I wanted to get into, because the next part that Bob Murphy talks about is the fractional reserve banking system. So the classical or conspiratorial or Austrian view of this is that banks lend based on the amount of reserves that they have from savers or whatever else. And because there's a certain ratio beyond which they can lend, whether it's 10 to 1 or 100 to 1. Let's say it's 10 to 1. If a bank had $1,000, most people would think, okay, if I have to keep 10% of the money I have and I'm able to lend out the rest, that means I'm able to lend out $900. But according to the bank, if they have $1,000, that means they're able to lend out $9,000 because they still have $1,000 left over at the bank. And this is the thing fundamentally that restricts the bank's ability to lend out money. You're saying that's not the case.
No, the bank doesn't lend based on how much reserves it has sitting around. The bank and no loan officer sits in the office and looks at the bank's reserves and waits until there's enough reserves to make loans. It's just not how banking works. There's one thing that's interesting. I think at one point in this clip, Steph says that the Austrians are particularly good about banking, or that they particularly understand well how banking works.
I caught that, yeah.
But where are the bankers? Did you talk to somebody who owns a bank maybe to corroborate these things that you're saying? Or did you maybe talk to a high-level bank CEO or manager or something like that? Because they would all tell you that that's not how banking works.
Because the way banking works, the way that you just mentioned it, is the only thing that is actually preventing a bank from loaning out money is a ready and willing borrower. It's not that they have some ratio of reserves or whatever that they need to have before they make that loan. They just find the borrower, make the loan, that creates the money out of nothing. And then because there is this fractional reserve that they're supposed to have, after they make the loan, then they turn around and find the reserves.
Yeah, like every 2 weeks or so. Or they just, basically, they worst case, they just have an overdraft at the Fed and pay interest.
Right, and then the point after that is the reserves are always available.
Yes, the reserves are always available. Yeah, at the interest rate. They're totally 100% state-imposed, manipulated interest rate.
I want to talk about that in a sec. because I think that this is a point that's worth hammering in.
Yeah, because so we get to that, I think, in 745, right? When Murphy says interest rate is a pricing signal for scarcity. Sorry, but go ahead.
Yeah. That I think this is a super duper important point, because the argument about the money supply, if the money supply is the thing, let's just go with the Austrians and say, okay, the money supply is the thing which is causing the boom or the bust, or causing this business cycle. Even if that's the case, this fractional reserve banking idea doesn't explain what's actually going on to control the money supply. The money supply is controlled, at least from the private banking system, by willing and able borrowers. And I think another way to say that is also underwriting standards, because part of the definition of an able borrower is if the underwriter gives you a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Yeah.
So banks are privileged state institutions. Essentially, they are public-private institutions. They're the lending agents of the state. So they need to be regulated accordingly, just like the military and other state institutions need to be regulated. Because of their privileged position, they can make loans and personally not, face severe benefits necessarily. Although usually, a bank, if they make bad loans, they'll just go out of business and people have to get laid off, and I guess the CEO will get fired. So there are some, hopefully some
deterrence.
Deterrence to that kind of bad behavior. But it's a very lucrative position to be in, to be a private bank, so-called private bank. And so there's some regulations that just make sense. Like I said, just as it makes sense to regulate the police and to have a Fourth Amendment, that kind of stuff.
Right. And to corroborate what we're saying, that the fractional reserve ratio isn't controlling the money supply. Well, all you have to do is go look at Canada, because the reserve requirements for Canada now are a whopping 0%. If the fractional reserve banking system was the limiting factor for the money supply in the economy, then Canada should have undergone hyperinflation, a couple minutes essentially after the 0% reserve requirement was put into place.
A reserve requirement is really just basically like a tax on the banks. It's all it is. It's nothing more, nothing spectacular other than that.
Because it's money they have to hold that they could have done something else with to make money.
Well, that's money they may have to obtain to meet reserve requirements at times. And to obtain those reserves, they pay interest on it. That functions like a tax, essentially, because it's an institutional requirement to hold those reserves, So it's like a small tax that they pay, essentially.
So let's move on to the next thing.
Yeah.
Murphy then says that interest rates are essentially a price which signals scarcity.
It's just so 7:45. Okay, 7 minutes 45 seconds. That's where Murphy says interest rate is a price signaling scarcity. And my response to that is no, it's not. It's whatever the Fed decides. I'd be curious to hear Austrian's explanation on why the savings rate always trails the Fed funds rate almost precisely.
And by the savings rate, you mean the amount of money the interest I would get if I went and deposited my money at a bank.
Yes.
Got it.
Either way, or money that you pay if you borrow.
Got it.
But I'm just saying. So yeah. Sorry. Yeah, where I was saying savings rate just now. Yeah, I meant the money you get on your savings account, the interest you get in your savings account. But
so why is that the case?
Well, because the Fed intervenes on the interbank lending market and sets a short-term rate, and that short-term rate, basically, the savings rate is another short-term rate. So the banks, if they don't want to go on the interbank market, then they just obtain savings deposits, and they pay a slightly lower rate for the savings deposits than they would have to pay on the interbank lending market. So that way they save a little bit on cost. But it's always determined 100% by the Federal Reserve's policy. It's not that...
And the policy is simply an arbitrary political decision.
Yeah, it's not like there's some pool of... We'll get into that, I hope, but there's not some pool.
Yeah, get into it now.
Well, there's at some point, I think Steph talks about the bank needs to accumulate a pool of savings before they can loan it out. But I think we'll get to that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I remember that now, too. Yeah.
But my point here is just interest rates. It has nothing to do with a matching of the supply and demand of savings and credit on some market. It's imaginary. The interest rate just always exactly trails the Federal Reserve's policy rate. So,
well, and I think this thinking comes from the idea that we're treating money like it's a commodity.
Exactly. It all goes back to the barter theory of money. It always goes back to the barter theory of money. which I think is what we talked about on show number 1, isn't it? We really hit hard on the barter theory of money, because what's important to understand. Okay, we've been talking about the private banking system, how it can create money, but the government can create money as well. That the supply of money, its creation and its destruction, it's not like it's following the laws of conservation of energy or the laws of conservation of matter, right? Where it's where this money is a scarce resource that needs to have price signals to tell us what, how rare that resource is or how scarce that resource is right now. Well, because banks make money out of nothing, because the government makes money out of nothing and they destroy it into nothing, and the banks also destroy it into nothing when you pay it back, it's not, the same rules don't apply. Yeah.
So when the Fed is moving interest rates up and down, it has nothing to do with the scarcity of money. It's just them picking a number.
Yeah. Because they think the interest rate has an impact on inflation or deflation or whatever their policy targets are. But, we discussed before, they really don't actually.
Well, and they do a little bit, and the little bit that they do are actually backwards from what they think.
Possibly, yeah, exactly. Yeah,
possibly. I'll recap it really quick just to satisfy anybody's curiosity. So the common understanding is that when the interest rates are low, people have easy access to money, and so the pool of money increases. And when the interest rates are high, the money's more expensive, and so it's harder to get more money from the private banking system, so the pool of money decreases. Well, as we just went over, that's not the mechanism which is controlling the pool of money. The mechanism controlling the pool of money is a ready and able borrower that meets underwriting standards. What's actually happening...
Also government deficit spending, by the way, we didn't mention that, and current account surplus.
Yeah, we have
also.
Yeah, we haven't gotten into that one yet. We'll definitely have to. But the interest rate, particularly the Fed interest rate, is the interest that the government is paying on bonds. And the government pays those bonds out of nothing. They're simply marking numbers up in an account. There's this great myth that the government is taxing and borrowing in order to be able to spend. But that it's simply a syllogistic fallacy. I guess that's it's just a fallacy.
Just to correct you there, the Fed interest rate is not the interest rate paid on all bonds. It's the interest rate paid on the shortest term bonds at any given time. If bonds are issued around now, they're going to reflect whatever the Fed policy rate is right now. However, the longer you go, the more it also involves speculation by investors as to how these individual short-term interest rate decisions are going to pan out down the road, as we also discussed in our last podcast. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So the short-term bonds, the interest rate determines what the government is paying on these short-term bonds, and there's this myth that the government needs to tax and to borrow in order to spend, but it's simply it doesn't make logical sense that the entity which has the monopoly issuing power over a currency could possibly need it to spend money. You know, if I have the ability to infinitely create money, it doesn't make sense for me to have to borrow some from Nima in order to spend something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead. Did you want to?
These so-called bonds are just basically like certificates of deposit
free money
at a bank. Yeah, they're just the government selling you a certificate of deposit at a certain interest rate, and it's risk-free because the government can create and issue the money. So you eliminate any risk, and the government basically provides a risk-free income to people who want to put aside their money.
Right, and it's not like they're when if you buy a bond from me, the government, and the day comes that I have to make good on that bond and pay you back, I don't have to run over and tax or run over and sell another bond in order to pay you off. All the government does is just mark a number up on your bank account.
Yeah,
it doesn't come from anywhere.
That's literally how it works. The bank removes the bond from your bank securities account, marks up your bank's reserves, and that's it.
And it's a little weird to think about, and the way to simplify it is it's analogous to a savings and checking account. Reserves are similar to your to your savings account. Reserves are similar to your checking account, and bonds are similar to your savings account. They simply have different interest rates. And what's happening, if you go from bonds to reserves or reserves to bonds, you're just transferring money from savings account to checking account or vice versa.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
So reserves are basically what a bank holds in its checking account at the Fed, basically.
Can you expand on that? Reserves are the what the bank has in their checking account at the Fed?
Well, yeah. So every bank basically has a bank account at the Federal Reserve, and in that bank account, they hold reserves, and the public doesn't have access to that banking system. It's just a system between the banks and the Fed. So for the banks, holding money in reserves is like for you and me holding a checking account at a bank. And for the banks to hold bonds is like for you and me to hold a certificate of deposit at a bank. However, of course, the public is also able to purchase government bonds, you know.
Mm-hmm. And then when you said before that it's essentially free money for people who already have money, if you think about it this way, let's say you're sitting on a ton of money, you got $1 million that's sitting in a savings account. Well, if you're going to earn 0% in the savings account versus 2% on a government bond, well, you might as well buy government bonds and earn your 2%. So this is what the banks do as well, is if they got extra money, and particularly if it's outside of their, reserve requirements, they'll just stick it in bonds.
Yes.
Because they might as well make that extra money. And this is that risk-free rate that you were talking about.
Yeah.
And this is why the interest rates always seem to follow the private banking interest rates always seem to follow the federal interest rate, is because let's say what did the interest rates just go up to 2.5 or 2.25? What are we at?
Yeah, 2.
Fed just raised it.
2.5, and we're supposed to. I believe by December we're going to be at 2.5.
Let's say 2.5 because that's easier to say.
Yeah.
If we're at 2.5, if bonds are paying out at 2.5%, why would a bank lend out money at 2.5% or less to you, where you might not pay them back? You might default. Whereas if they go to the government and take their money and give it to government, they have a risk-free 100% guarantee that they're going to get their 2.5%. So when they loan anybody money, it's going to be whatever that risk-free rate is plus the risk of you, whatever your credit and income and ability to pay that back is. It's going to be that risk-free rate plus that rate. And similarly, if we have a deposit at a bank, because they can make more money on this risk-free rate, and also on the money that they're loaning out, because the risk-free rate is higher, as I just explained, they're able to pay you more money in your savings account because of it. I got all that right, Nima?
Well, yeah, they have to pay more because all the banks are going to be trying to attract savings, so they have to be competitive. And yeah, the treasury bill is, of course, always sort of a cap on, or sort of
a floor.
Makes the private banks compete for savings, because people could also just put their money in a treasury bill.
Right. That's a good point, where if a treasury bill is going to give me 2.5%, why would I deposit it into a bank that's going to give me 1%?
Yeah. So then that's why the savings, they always adjust, if the Fed increases their policy rate, then the savings accounts are also going to be following. And if there's savings accounts, some savings accounts pay really bad rates, actually. So that's why I always tell people, well, at least what I do is for my savings, I put them in treasury bills, because they always pay the best rates consistently. I mean, in my experience, at least.
Yeah, well, it's risk-free, right? I mean,
right. But it's risk-free, and the rate is better than a savings account. Because in a savings account, you have limitations through the FDIC and stuff. Not all money is insured. But with a treasury bill, it doesn't matter. There's no such limit. It's all 100% insured by the state. And it pays a better interest rate. So it doesn't make any sense, really. It's, savings accounts are actually a pretty lousy bargain for most people, in most cases that I've seen, at least.
So now that you mentioned the FDIC, that's actually one of the next points that we're getting into here.
So in 925, Murphy suggests that the Fed is there to bail banks out, but generally that's not their job, and banks fail all the time with shareholders losing all the money, etc., except the deposit holders who are insured by the FDIC, which is not really a problem to the system at all. There's no reason that deposit holders should lose their money because their bank failed.
So you're saying, because I've heard this from a lot of Austrian economists, and I think Warren Mosler was the best counterpoint that I ever heard against it. And that the idea is that banks in a free market should be allowed to take whatever risks they want, and the people who deposit the money in those banks should be aware of those risks, and that the deposits will naturally follow the banks that are going to make the most money, regardless of risk. And the depositors can, say, okay, how much risk am I willing to deal with? And I'll deposit my money there. Well, Warren Mosler points out a really good idea, which is most people have no idea what a goddamn bank is doing. And they can't make a decision on, okay, this bank is going to be, investing in this, and that has this much risk, so I think I'm going to put my money there, or this bank's going to be doing this or that. They just want a secure place to put their money. And as we've just been explaining, it's not like this money is a scarce commodity, and it's simply numbers getting tracked in a system, whether that's the bank or the Federal Reserve itself. Just because a bank goes out and loses its ass on speculative markets, there's no reason why a person who deposited his money not with the intention of, okay, I'm going to invest in this bank because it's speculating in X, Y, or Z. I just deposit my money because I had to deposit it in a bank somewhere to keep it safe. There's no reason why that person should lose all their money.
Yeah. I mean, they got paid for a service, and the banking system is essentially just a state system. and the banks are the state's lending agent, and they've loaned money out. And if they've made a bad bet, then okay, the system is designed such that the banks fail, but the individual still should retain the credits that were assigned to him based on whatever service or product he sold on the market. So there's no reason,
right? Which the FDIC insurance, it kind of agrees with you, but it only agrees with you up to $250,000,
which makes no sense.
Which we both say is bullshit.
Yeah. The FDIC could just as well insure all deposits, and it would not make a huge difference. Wouldn't be a big problem. But this way, the only thing is that people will just resort to or escape to treasury securities, because there you
right. You can just bypass the whole thing.
Yeah, for amounts beyond that, you don't have to worry about any such risk.
Now, I've heard this argument before, and particularly it was from Steph in videos past in the 3,000 whatever he's done. Is that FDIC insurance is another government subsidy, which creates a kink in the free market system, which is that because banks know that their depositors have their funds guaranteed up to $250,000, they're less careful with their speculation because they know that the money is subsidized.
Yes,
and that in a free market this wouldn't be the case. Now, did you want to start?
Well, I mean, there may be some truth to that. That's why banking has to be heavily regulated. There's always an element of moral hazard in the banking system for these types of reasons.
Well, the point that I wanted to make is, yes, this FDIC is somewhat of a government subsidy and is an intrusion from the government, but the bank itself is an intrusion from the government.
The whole thing is a government system.
So I want to emphasize this again, and if you want to learn more about this, go back and listen to episode 1. We really dug into this concept that money, historically speaking, the evidence points to that it's a state construct, not a construct of the free market, that states existed before markets. I know this is anathema to Austrian and libertarian thinking, and I don't like it either.
Even money existed before markets. Sorry, I didn't mean to throw you out there.
No. Yeah, Nima says something like that, and I just get thinking, and I shut up. What I wanted to get at is that it's not like everybody was using money, and then the state came along and screwed everything up. And that this if we could just get rid of things like FDIC insurance, where the state comes in and bumps up against things and gets in the way and tries to make sure that we're all safe and playing nice with each other, but it does it with violence, so it just makes everything worse.
The way you limit the state,
that makes sense if you're applying it to something that was the free market in the first place, but the money isn't. The banking system isn't. The whole thing is state. And like you said before, with for example, comparing this to the military, to saying that the banking system shouldn't be regulated is kind of like saying the military shouldn't be regulated, which is strange because the military is a regulation. That's all it is. That's all it operates by. To take away regulation would be to take away the military, or to take away regulation from the banking system would simply be to erase it.
Yeah.
What were you going to say?
Oh, I don't know. 10:30.
Oh. 10:30? Okay, we're moving on. I guess I got so excited, Nima forgot.
Yeah, no, it's all good. So 10:30, Murphy talks about a move away from equity financing toward debt financing.
Meaning in the past or or something that should be done in the future?
No, he supposed that that's been going on, a move away from equity financing towards more debt financing. But from what I've read, actually, the exact opposite has occurred. The ratio has drastically shifted towards more equity financing and a crackdown on lots of restrictions on credit financing under the theory that would fight inflation. And we're going to be talking about Minsky's book one of these days. And in there, he has a brilliant quote. And I think, I don't have it handy right now, but it's something along the lines of the attempts to fight credit creation have induced the private sector to find workarounds in the form of equity financing and other exotic instruments. So
when we say equity financing versus debt financing, what exactly do we mean here?
Stocks. When the company issues shares of common stock. And debt financing is it's a loan. So
if I start a company and I need to raise $1 million, I could either go to a bank and borrow $1 million, or I could say, okay, I'm going to sell 1 million shares at $1 a piece, and there's my $1 million.
And you sell that to the public, and there's no new money created in that case. It's just inside, basically. It's just a new savings asset for the private sector. But it's basically, I remember when I was growing up in Germany, nobody was really talking much about stock markets and stuff like that. And people didn't really have much money in stocks. And you can notice when a society moves towards more and more equity financings, and everyone talks about their stock portfolios and stuff like that. But it's totally possible. Same thing goes for Japan. By the way, an excellent documentary about Japan, I believe it's called The Masters of the Yen.
The Princes of Yen.
Princes of Yen or something like that.
I actually haven't finished it yet. That is a most excellent documentary.
Right. So they also talk about,
as far as I've gotten through it.
Japan went through similar episodes, but there are places, or there used to be times and places, at least I know from Germany, where people would just have the majority of their money in savings accounts, and we're totally fine with that. No need to have a big stock portfolio or whatever. I'm not saying that's what I do or that I recommend that, but it's just I'm saying it's totally possible to have a society where people are less into stock market speculation, just because there's the equity instruments represent a smaller share of all the instruments floating around, all the savings instruments. And so, I don't really see that there's such a move that Murphy supposes. If anything, probably the other way around. And then at 11:15, Murphy talks about the narrow bank, which the narrow bank, from what I understood, I read something about it recently. There was a great article by Cullen Roche that I'm also going to post in the notes about narrow banking. But I think narrow banking is essentially just that the bank has to back all their loans with the reserves. Okay? So they are basically just self-imposing a reserve requirement. So they're self-imposing essentially what is like a tax. So they're just paying a little more taxes and they're hurting their profitability. And that's all they're doing.
Right. Under the guise that we're not going to overextend ourselves in this fractional reserve banking system.
But as we talked about before, however much the bank lends out has nothing to do with the reserves they hold. Right? So they just obtain 100% reserves then. That's then their policy. Okay, and they're going to be paying interest on whatever reserves they need to borrow at times if they want to maintain that standard. But it's just a self-imposed tax, essentially. And nothing really beneficial to anyone, actually, from what I have. That's just my opinion. I have to read up a little more about narrow banking. And at 12:10 says it doesn't take a genius to borrow money from the Fed and then park it in some other account at more interest.
Wait, Steph says it?
Steph says it at around 12 minutes and 10 seconds. Yeah. So they sort of mocking the market a bit, or sort of the banking business a little bit. And I wrote down a note here. So the way he described it, that doesn't really happen, and it's not how banking works. The ones who are indeed getting a subsidy are the savers, or in summation, everyone with money in a savings account. They benefit from the Fed's upward manipulation of interest rates. Because Steph is saying that apparently the banks are borrowing money from the Fed and then parking it in some other account at more interest. it's not really how it works. If you borrow money from the Fed, you're going to be paying a higher interest rate than.
So I think this comes back from the quantitative easing and the fact that the Fed is now paying a small interest rate on savings.
Yeah, the Fed,
or on reserves,
the Fed paying a small interest rate on savings is just a technical switch in implementing the policy rate on the market. Previously, they did it by selling treasury bonds, and now they're doing it by just paying outright interest on reserves.
Well, and I think this is a quantitative easing allusion.
Yeah, but he didn't talk about quantitative
or alluding to.
But I don't know. But
what's that?
He didn't talk about quantitative easing at that point yet. But maybe I don't know.
Well, I think this was so quantitative easing is where banks have bonds, and then the Fed swaps the bonds for reserves. And if they're paying on the reserves, this 0.25% interest rate, where they can say, okay, well, if we put our reserves at the Federal Reserve, at least we'll get 0.25% on these reserves. I think that's what's being construed as being paid to park money at the Fed.
Right. Yeah, we'll get to that.
You see what I'm saying?
I know. I have a couple of points where we'll definitely delve into that.
Okay, we'll table that one.
Yeah. So then 1230, Bob Murphy suggests that it's new that the Fed is subsidizing banks with interest payments on reserves. But the Fed has always subsidized the banking system by manipulating rates upwards. Previously, it was through selling treasury bills to manipulate the interbank lending rate. Now it's through paying interest outright on reserves. Okay, that's actually exactly what we just talked about, I guess. The two aren't fundamentally different in their economic impact. They're just different technical methods of achieving the same thing. Then at 1248, Bob Murphy suggests paying interest on reserves makes banks keep their reserves at the Fed instead of lending them out. But
which doesn't make any sense because that's not what happens, as we've just talked about many times.
Yeah, the banks don't lend out reserves into the private sector. They can't lend out reserves to consumers or to businesses because that's not how banking works. Reserves are the bank's money, not the customer's money. The consumer's money is bank accounts and cash. Banks create bank account money when they make loans by marking up bank accounts. They don't need reserves to do this. They obtain the reserves later as needed to meet clearing demand and institutional reserve requirements, which are nothing but a tax on the banks.
And I want to emphasize this again, sorry to interrupt you, is that when we say marking up bank accounts, we literally mean that. Like there's no wads of cash moving around anywhere. It's all accounting in a ledger. That's obviously now it's electronic. It's simply rewriting a number in an account. That's it.
Yes.
And I interrupted your train of thought.
Well, so just concluding here that there's no such correlation between whatever banks have to maintain in reserves, that has any impact on their lending behavior. And there's no such thing as lending reserves out to consumers or whatever. In 1340, Steph explains how low-income families were pushed into housing through lending mandates, which we agree with. I'd say Dylan and I think.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to the ready and able borrowers.
They weren't able.
If the government comes out and says, okay, you need to lend to more of these people, well, you're just changing the definition of able.
Yeah.
In the ready and able borrowers, right? Now more people are becoming able because you just set the standards lower.
Yeah. And in general, lending standards were very poor. Another thing that we also pointed out already. So that may well have contributed to excessive lending. And also, our biggest red flag, net private savings began declining due to a rising current account deficit and taxes were too high. Progressive taxation systems always move toward balanced budget and economic expansion, which has been the cause of every depression in this country since 1776.
Now, that was some compact stuff right there, Nima. Yeah. I don't think we have time today to unpack all of that, But I think we should talk about net private saving and deficit a little bit.
Yeah.
But again, please check out our previous episodes. We go over this in detail, why this is the case, that net private saving is so important, and what the role of government deficits have in that net private saving, and why that's the most important thing to look out for when it comes to recessions and depressions.
Yeah, in short, when you see net private saving going very low or declining, then the private sector goes in a lot of bank debt usually, and then that leads to unsustainable booms and then ensuing busts. So
instead of the interest rate.
Yes.
Right, because that was the one of the premises of this whole conversation that Bob and Steph are having, is that, it's by watching the interest rates by the Federal Reserve, we can get an idea of these booms and busts. We're saying, no, you need to watch the net private savings to get an idea of when these booms and busts are coming.
Yes. And at 1530...
go ahead.
Well, no,
I was going to keep harping on that, but we should move on.
Okay. At 1530, Murphy suggests that interest rates reflect the availability of savings. They don't. They are 100% determined by the Federal Reserve Bank's Fed funds rate,
which is a totally arbitrary political decision.
Yes. And again, my question would be to Bob Murphy and Steph would be, why is the savings rate always so precisely trailing the Fed funds rate? Is that just coincidence? I'd like to, hear the case for that. Okay, it's 1615. Steph asks why it always starts with the business sector first. And my answer is that the investment spending is a very...
What exactly starts with the business sector first?
Oh, like a recession, a bust. The answer is that investment spending is a large and volatile component contributing to aggregate corporate profits via aggregate demand. So, as we've probably discussed before, investment spending is a very big component in the determination of aggregate corporate profits. And,
last episode we talked about this a lot.
Yeah, employment, of course. And so that's why these recessions oftentimes start in the business sector. Because investment is what businesses do. It's not what consumers do usually. 2007, 2008, we may have had like a residential investment crash, but in general, it starts in the business sector. Of course, the business sector also, so towards 2007, when we were coming up on the recession, basically, the private sector's net saving had started declining significantly, and that's why we think that the private sector started purchasing less, and car sales absolutely collapsed. That was sort of one of the first big indicators, as Warren Mosler pointed out. And then when car sales collapse, then corporations make less money. And then that's a big signal, I guess. So that in that sense, that's probably why a lot of this always starts in the corporate sector. And I just started at 1547. Murphy refers to the Austrian story a couple of times, and I just wanted to point out that I agree that it's a story. I agree with that terminology. Yeah, it's a cool story. Yeah.
And in fact, I need to cool story, bro. I need to bring something up. This is something going back to the debate I had with Bob Murphy on the Tom Woods show, where I described, in quotes, the story of where money came from, which was the state theory of money, and specifically what we've learned from David Graeber's book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, where he meticulously details the history of credit and money and states and markets and the relationships and the orders that they came into. And Bob's response to that was like, well, I could tell a different story. And I just want to say, Bob, my story had evidence to it. Yours is just a story. So Please continue.
Yeah, okay. So then at 1649, Murphy explains how Austrians are skeptical of empirical studies. I just thought in that moment, so we're on a philosophy show right now. Wouldn't Steph have some questions?
Yeah, that confused it. That confused the hell out of me.
Wouldn't there be some questions automatically popping up in your mind, just out of curiosity? I wonder.
So now, but why are the Austrians skeptical of the empirical studies? Because they typically are neo-Keynesian, or why?
Well, we should let Murphy explain that, but I just think it.
Okay, I did notice that as well, and I thought that was pretty funny.
Right.
Strange.
Right. I mean, because you and I, we believe that empirical studies are paramount, right? We need to have empirical studies to corroborate the shit we say. Like, how else do we verify? How else do we test our theories other than empiricism? So I think this is something that the Austrians sometimes sort of just say in passing or brush over, but it's kind of
But that's kind of the core to all things.
Yeah, it's an important
in order
issue.
To do anything scientific method.
It could be a problem. I'm just saying.
Logic.
I'm just saying maybe there's a problem in your theory. If that's one of its basic tenets. And at 1752 says that interest is the price of money, or at least in a free market or something, but it's not, right? It's set by the Federal Reserve Bank, a monopoly price setter. And then also Steph talks once again about how interest rates are indicators of savings available. And then at 1755, it gets really interesting because...
Pause real quick before we get in. Or do you want me to let you have your flow?
No, it's okay. Pause.
Okay, so if we talk about the interest being the price of money, I keep thinking about this in terms of thinking of money as a commodity. And in some sense, me and you and everybody listening to this, we kind of have to treat money like a commodity in our private lives, right? Particularly if we're working for a wage. If we're doing big business and we're just, generating money from banks all the time to do whatever we're doing, it's a different story. But in terms of, if we got a blue collar job and we're out making a certain number of dollars an hour for 40 years, in a certain sense, that money is a commodity. So if I were to do that for 40 years and I saved up some money and someone came to me and wanted a loan, would the interest rate that I want be the price of my money? I think in that case, it's yes. But even then, the interest rate that I'm going to come up with is certainly going to reflect the interest rates available by the Fed.
Yes.
And by banks.
Yeah, you would charge, right? Unless you're
I would charge a little more than a bank would charge.
Yeah, unless you're a little incompetent, you would certainly charge more than you can get on a savings account, right?
Yeah.
So that's always
and I charge more than a bank would charge because I have to say, hey, I'm taking on the risk and all of your risk, and I'm not a bank that's got 1,000 loans that can eat it.
Yeah, you're a money lender.
If you don't pay back.
You're actually a money lender. It's like Minsky defines money lenders as these kinds of entities that you're just saying that literally accumulate money somehow and then lend that money out, and they're fundamentally different from banks actually, because banks are not money lenders. Banks, they just create the money out of nothing and identify opportunities, identify good credit risks, and sort of accept people's liabilities and exchange issue their own liabilities, which is access to bank reserves.
And I think I may be going off on a little tangent, but I think it's worth mentioning that because of that, if we compare people who are actually money lenders versus banks who are money creators or credit creators, I think one of the reasons that we're able to have long-term loans like mortgages, or even a car loan that's like 5 or 8 years or whatever. Hard money lenders, or, I'm using real estate investing terms, money lenders if you find one that's more than 2 years, that's a long loan to a private money lender.
Yeah.
And the reason is they need their money back. They need it to use stuff, whereas the bank, they're just like, well, we just created that out of nothing. So, I mean, it didn't really change our ability to do whatever else we were going to do anyway. And I think that's one of the reasons, at least, the way that we've designed our society, that banks are kind of necessary for what we're doing, because private capital can't make these long-term commitments the same way a bank can.
Yeah, and there's people who are slowly starting to find that out the hard way. I think also because I'm just thinking of a couple of crypto platforms that try to just be the lending institution in crypto and just attract investors and people who need money. So it's basically savers and borrowers. And I think they had to shut down now, actually, because and I actually was on that platform for the most part, actually just to try it out. And, a lot of people defaulting on the loans. There's a lot of issues on there that sort of, I think it made...
Figuring out creditworthiness is no child's game.
Yeah. And that's what the banks do.
There's a reason why underwriters are underwriters.
Yeah,
they got to know their shit.
So should we move on with Steph's statement?
Yeah, let's move on.
So in 1755, Steph says that if the banks accumulate a bunch of savings, then they have a bunch of money to lend out, and if there's a low interest rate, it's justified to be low. But if it's manipulated down by the Fed, then that's bad, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's just a fallacy upon fallacy here. The banks don't accumulate savings to then loan it out. It doesn't work that way. It's never worked that way. The banks make loans, and in making loans, they create savings, actually. That's why for every bank loan, there's a deposit, because every bank loan creates a new deposit. And so that's how banking actually works. And banks don't accumulate a bunch of money. There's no interest rate that then signals to entrepreneurs that there's a deferral of spending going on, that kind of stuff.
And you know what we haven't mentioned yet?
What was that?
You finish your thought.
Yeah.
Thought first.
Okay. So then also the Fed rate is not manipulated down. It's never manipulated down. It's always manipulated up. And we already explained that the Fed always manipulates risk rates up to differing levels above zero. There's no such thing as banks.
That's literally what I was going to say, which is I don't think we mentioned it specifically went over it in this episode yet. Austrians always talk about the Fed manipulating interest rates down. Yeah. And what we're saying is, no, they manipulate it up.
Yeah, because...
Why is that the case?
Because if the Fed didn't sell any bonds into the interbank lending market, then the interbank lending rate would fall to zero, because banks would always try to get rid of excess reserves and loan them out, and they would outcompete each other. Whichever bank needed reserves would borrow it on that market, and whichever bank had excess reserves would loan it out on that market. And so, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
No, I'll pick it up for you. And this is evidenced by the fact that the interbank lending market trails the Fed rate, right? It's always just a hair above the Fed rate.
Yeah, or very close to it. Yeah. So
the Austrian economists always see the lowering of interest rates as the Federal Reserve / the government interfering with the price of money. Now, we've already talked about that the interest rates aren't indicative of the price of money,
right?
For a bank or the government, but because these interest rates are purely an arbitrary decision. What they're doing is they're setting a floor for a free money rate, a risk-free money rate that the banks take advantage of. And because the banks take advantage of it, their interest rates essentially use that rate as a floor to raise their rates from.
Yeah.
So if we're going to call the Fed adjusting interest rates interference by the Fed, then the only way they can interfere is by pushing them up.
Yeah.
With an asterisk, unless they go negative, like it is in Japan, then yes, they're also interfering by pushing it negative. Anything from zero.
Yeah. Because otherwise, in a market where they wouldn't do that, the risk-free rate would fall to zero, exactly. So the free market in interbank lending would produce a risk-free rate of 0%, or very close to it, 0.001 or 0.1 or whatever. And the only manipulation is always upwards. So then also, I already explained loans create savings. In fact, there would be almost no private savings without loans. Banks create deposits out of nowhere and then acquire whatever reserves needed for clearing demand plus institutionally required reserves. And then at 8:25, Steph says, businesses start building for a future that never comes. That's the cause, what happens in the Austrian business cycle.
When the interest rates are low, which creates the easy to get money.
Right.
And
the skewed time horizon.
They get ready for the thing that's going to come, and then the interest rates rise, and then the money shrinks, and then they crash. Yeah. This is the business
actually,
cycle.
It's more like the future could have come, but it's prevented by overtaxation of the private sector. I mean, that's in essence your and my theory, just generally what MMT says, that the private sector is taxed too much in relation to what the public sector is spending or injecting into the private sector, in other words. And also sometimes additionally also due to current account deficits, of course. The evidence is that every time net private savings, in other words, the budget deficits plus the current account surplus, falls, a depression occurs. So we're saying that that's the cause of the drop in demand, but that could have been avoided by just taxing the people less. In other words, like Warren Mosler said, there's no crisis so deep that it can't be combated by a fiscal adjustment.
And taxes are the easiest fiscal adjustment to look at. And we say this often, Nima and I, that most MMT discussion, resources, individuals that you're going to find are actually probably going to be more of the leftist persuasion. And when they say that when they look at this fiscal adjustment that needs to be made, they say, okay, we need to do that by spending more. And that is a way to do it. However, Nima and I are no fans of big government. And we figure, well, not only does it not increase the government to lower taxes, but it's done easier. If you're going to spend more, you've got to take the time to create some new bureaucratic crap hole. Whereas if you're going to lower the taxes, all you got to do is change a few numbers in the tax code. So it's the easiest thing to do.
Yeah, no doubt. And 1935, Murphy says low interest rates set in motion long-term projects. And I don't really think there's necessarily evidence for this. So
I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware of this theory. It's called the Austrian business cycle theory. And the belief that interest rates are somehow an expression of time preference and of the availability of savings and stuff like that, and people's time preference. But once again, that's at odds with the fact that the savings rate always just trails the federal funds rate. That doesn't make any sense, So they would have to. I think they would have to respond to that dilemma in order to rescue their theory.
Well, and I think it's worth going through this thought experiment. So if we're going to be a business that needs a loan, and let's say we're in a situation where situation A, we can get that loan at 4%. Situation B, we get that loan at 15%. Now, all things being equal, obviously, we want the 4% loan. It's simply going to be easier for us to set our business up to make that happen. However, the 15% loan doesn't mean that the business can't happen. It just needs to be set up in a way that the debt can be financed.
Yeah, and I mean, and if the income is sufficient, or
is enough,
the expected
you're
income
fine.
is sufficient, which is a subset or a function of other factors, then it's totally possible to finance whatever the price of the debt or the interest rate is going to be.
Yeah, and then an aspiring entrepreneur, they're going to figure out how to do it.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, I'm
it's possible.
I'm Elon Musk.
It's possible that,
and I guess I can't do anything now because interest rates are 15%.
It's possible that the government imposes austerity through budget surplus, etc. Then, they could actually be stifling progress, and because the incomes are too low, right, people would be investing less.
But then the interest rate is secondary at that point.
Exactly. I'm just saying, like, the interest rate is not an important factor in the cause of depressions or business cycles or whatever. So at 2050, Steph talks about how it would be great to have a more stable and predictable Fed policy. And I agree.
I agree with that.
I mean, we say set a rate of 0.25% for eternity, done. That would be the most stable solution you could possibly have.
And why do we say 0.25 instead of 0?
Well, I mean, Minsky has written that it makes some sense for the banks to have some cost of funds, so that there's more discipline and more sort of future profit-oriented thinking baked in, if that makes sense.
Got it.
It may be possible to just have a 0 too, but who knows?
But it should be low and it should stay there, and we shouldn't care about it.
Predictability predictability is more important than anything. Yeah.
And I don't want to get in it here, but it was I don't even remember what episode it was now. Was it the last one before, whatever? Actually, no, it was the permanent portfolio episode. Nima specifically gets into the relationship of the expectations or the predictability or lack of predictability of the Fed policy rate and how that affects the stock market.
Yeah.
Brilliant explanation. Totally check it out. Also good for your own portfolio. Just saying.
Exactly. Then at 2545, Murphy again says paying interest on reserves discourages from lending. It doesn't. It just affects the interest rate banks charge each other for interbank reserve lending, essentially a tax on banks, but has nothing to do with loans made into the private sector. And then
let's harp on that again.
Yeah.
Interest rates do not. Banks paying. Banks getting paid interest on reserves has nothing to do with them loaning stuff out because the fractional reserve banking system doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It confuses cause and effect. The fractional reserve banking idea says you get reserves first and then you lend them out. When in actuality, it's backwards, which is you lend money out and you find reserves later. And the important point of this is the important thing to take away from that is if the cause and effect is reversed, that means the reserves are not the bottleneck for lending.
Correct. The reserves can't be a bottleneck because the reserves have to always be available at the policy rate. If they weren't, then that means that the policy rate would shoot up. And that doesn't happen. Policy rate always remains in the range that the Fed announces. So, paying interest on reserves doesn't discourage from lending. And that was that. And then actually, I wanted to say here, like in 2730, Murphy mentions liar loans. And we totally agree that, as we said before, lending standards were disasters at the banks and contributed hugely to the real estate or the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, we believe. But
and a liar loan, just so we're all on the same page, is people lying about their income.
Yes.
And banks not checking it
Statement
before
loans.
underwriting.
And liar loans were pervasive. They were across the board. They weren't just subprime loans. They were all normal loans as well. Huge amounts of liar loans across the board. Some people suggest that that was really the cause of the real estate bubble and the crash. And then at 3120, Murphy suggests that, something bad is going on in Japan and that QE must have been the cause of that. But QE doesn't have to be the cause of whatever supposedly bad economic situation it is that Japan is supposedly in. I wouldn't even necessarily say that they're in a bad economic situation. They're very low unemployment, etc.
I think they're overtaxed.
Yes, so there's an issue there, and that's probably why they're struggling, because they've just, raised their sales tax to insane levels, and their population is overtaxed. Once again, as we said before, the deficit is too low, or the exports are not enough. Which is, in the case of Japan, I don't think so, because they're basically an export nation. But
and then what's the prime minister's name? Shinzo Abe.
Yeah.
I read an article a while ago that he is planning on getting the country on a balanced budget by, I think, 2020 or like 2024 or something like that.
Oh man.
And I know Japan exports a lot of stuff, but if you're gonna super tax everybody and go for a balanced budget, it's that's rough.
They need to generate more export surpluses even. So maybe that's the plan. Who knows? But so just because QE happened in Japan, that must have been the cause. But yet you and I always say that there's really no evidence that QE has had any impact on the economy. And there's also no reason to expect that it would, because if you understand how the banking system works, then you understand that QE is just a rather spectacular private sector asset swap. And
right. Essentially, what we talked about before between the checking and savings account analogy to reserves and bonds.
Yeah.
That's all it is. That's what Nima means by the private sector asset swap.
And essentially, if it lowers interest rates, then okay. So then it's a move closer towards the natural risk-free rate environment that is not subsidized by government policy. So... or not manipulated upwards, where the interest rate is manipulated upwards by government policy. So then it's not necessarily really a bad thing per se. It's just reducing the subsidy paid out to people with money. Reducing a state subsidy, something the libertarians should be for.
Right. QE is not massively printing money and causing hyperinflation is what we're saying.
Right.
And we go over that in detail in previous episodes, so go check them out.
And then at 38.25, Murphy praises Trump's energy policy, which I also totally agree with. And I thought that was interesting. They mentioned that a lot of libertarians he knew from his circles were pointed to the energy policy. I was kind of happy to hear that, actually. Because,
me too. One of the thumbs up there.
One of the things that I find interesting about the hard progressive movement, they praise themselves as being so anti-neoliberal, but the neoliberals really got them yet again with their global warming alarmism. That's just another version of neoliberal austerity.
Well, it's climate change now because the Earth didn't actually heat up. Come on, Nima.
Yeah, climate change. Sorry.
We had to move the gogoalposts.
Yeah, it's whatever. It was global cooling in the 70s. It was global warming after. It's climate change.
You still need to freak out, even though we moved the goalposts.
Man, they just had Climate Week or whatever out here in San Francisco a little while ago. Anyway, they built a giant statue of a polar bear at the ferry building. And it's really just becoming like a religion, essentially. A religion building up its archetypes.
Do they have tweakers hanging around the polar bear? Shooting
polar bear was actually looking pretty scary, man. It was like had big claws. And I was like, that's actually kind of... But I think
polar bears are pretty scary. They'll they will eat you.
Yeah, and they will eat baby seals, too. So, just saying. What about the cute baby seals? Do you not care about those? So that's actually happy. I was happy to hear that. And also at 40.30, Murphy smashes the myth of peak oil, which we obviously totally agree with as well. And at 43.40, Murphy says the corporate income tax is particularly destructive. And we agree on that. And we also talked to Warren Mosler about that and how the corporate tax is really ultimately just a pass-through to the consumer. And products could be getting much cheaper in competitive markets as a result of the corporate tax cut. So I was just happy.
I think Murphy did bring it up because they were talking about the tax cuts, him and Steph, and that he was actually quite shocked that because he thinks, and again we think too, that the corporate tax cuts are great for the economy because we had the highest corporate tax rate in the world. He was just shocked that politically Trump was able to get it done, which I think I'm pretty shocked too.
Yeah.
I do want to say this about the tax cuts though. There's if you zoom out far enough and look at the tax code, there's really three different types of tax entities. There's the individual, there's a small business, and there's a big business, or these corporations. And corporations got this massive tax cut, which is great. And the individuals and the small business got a little bit, but it was crumbs compared to this corporate tax cut. And I think you posted it, Nima, on Facebook.
Yeah.
The House just got a new tax bill cut through, or through
3.8 trillion.
I mean, just the bill. I'm very curious what's aimed at the individual and the small business owner this time, because it was like I'm not saying I won't take it. It's not great that he got something through, but it was definitely crumbs compared to the corporate tax going from 35 to 21%.
Yeah.
I'd like to see something similar on my income tax rates.
You know, that's that austerity, that neoliberal austerity attitude always lurking in the background. Because it will come back. At one point, people will start talking about, oh my God, we need to balance the budget. We've spent beyond our means, blah, blah, blah. And that's always a possibility that that'll return. So there's always that danger.
Well, that's why we're making these.
That's why these tax cuts were so lackluster, as you just said. I think also, and really, we need to break through that thinking and make drastic changes. Yeah. So then, but otherwise, we all agree that corporate tax cut, that was actually a good thing. And at 59 minutes, Murphy talks about how the Treasury may have to default if interest rates keep rising. Okay,
I got to interject. So I specifically spoke/debated with Bob Murphy about this. Again, go check it out. We'll even link it in the show notes. Warren Mosler had a debate with Bob Murphy. We'll link this in the show notes as well. That it was an Austrian economics versus an MMT debate where Bob specifically acknowledges that a money issuer cannot default on debt. Now he goes into inflation and eroding the value of money, which we disagree with, but it is a separate conversation worth talking about. But the idea that a government, or it doesn't have to be government, an entity which issues its own money, can somehow default on it is logically inconsistent.
Yeah.
Syllogistically doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And Bob has acknowledged this, so I don't know why he keeps saying this.
Yeah. So also, if interest rates keeps rising, it just makes it look like the interest rate is this unpredictable animal. But and it kind of is actually, but by choice. Like we said, we could just declare one risk-free rate, and that would eliminate a bunch of speculation. And in any case, the Treasury can't default because they create the money. And the interest rates are arbitrarily determined by the Fed and could always be cut to zero if desired. So it's not a constraint on people. People always talk like, oh my God, the government, if the interest rate goes up, then they will have to pay out so much more, and then the deficit will grow. But it's not really an issue.
All they're doing is marking up bank accounts.
Yeah.
I want to bring in Warren Mosler's scoreboard analogy. So the Federal Reserve, we should say the federal government in general, neither has nor doesn't have money.
Correct.
The Federal Reserve essentially is like the scorekeeper of the economy. So if we're watching a football game and one side gets a touchdown and they get marked up 6 points, no one asks the scorekeeper where they got that 6 points from.
Right.
They're just marking stuff. Or if there was a review over the play and they find out no, it actually wasn't a touchdown. I don't know my football. Is it a flag or a foul or whatever? And they take the touchdown away. They take the 6 points away. No one asks, well, where did the 6 points go?
Right.
It's just someone keeping score, moving numbers up and down. That's all the Federal Reserve does, is they keep score, moving these numbers up and down. And the idea that they're going to like run out of points to keep score with, logically, doesn't make sense.
Yeah, there's no way for them to involuntarily default. Any default would be a manufactured event, essentially, if one were to happen. It would be by choice, where they would just say, oh my God, now we can't pay out anymore. And then, suddenly the treasuries wouldn't be so risk-free, wouldn't be considered to be so risk-free anymore. So then their prices would drop,
right?
Blah, blah, blah. And then, there would be some panic, but it would totally be by choice. The treasury can always create the money needed.
All right, Nima. So we're at the end of their conversation, and we're pushing an hour and a half here.
Yeah.
So I think we should wrap up. Is there any last thing you wanted to say?
No, I think we covered it pretty good. Yeah.
I think we covered it pretty well. I want to re-emphasize, we covered a lot of ground here, and there's a lot of things we touched on that really need to be unpacked, which we didn't. Go back and listen to our previous episodes. We really take a lot of time to unpack what we're talking about and where we're coming from. And one of the things that actually, this is one of the themes behind the video, is both Steph and Bob agreed that even though Trump is doing so good with all these things in the economy, whether it's the energy policy or lowering the corporate tax rate or whatever, that he's just kicking the can down the road because at some point the business cycle is kind of going to come smash around back and cause a greater crash. We completely disagree. And the way things are going right now, everything looks, I'm not going to say peachy because there's still quite a few problems, but economic doom is not around the corner. And we would like to hear your comments and hear your questions. If you've got an issue with what we said, if you're curious, like I said, go back and listen to episodes, send us a question. We're happy to talk about this. And with that, this is Dylan Moore and Nima Mahjour of Amagi, and we'll see you guys next week.